So I'm pleased and honored to introduce Professor A.E. Howard. This person truly needs no introduction, especially here, given all that he's done in the state and everywhere else. Professor Howard was a voted scholar at Oxford University. He served as a law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black. Professor Howard is the White Burkett Miller Professor of Law and Public Affairs at the University of Virginia School of Law. He recently earned the Thomas Jefferson Medal, the highest honor that the University of Virginia can bestow on a faculty member at that institution. Professor Howard has authored dozens of books and hundreds of articles and book chapters. He has consulted extensively with constitution makers in other countries and drafted Virginia's revised constitution, and I was privileged to work with him in that endeavor. He has taught at the University of Virginia School of Law for a half century, mentoring thousands of students. For all of his accomplishments, Professor Howard is a thoroughly decent and generous human being. I'm grateful to be the recipient of his generosity over many years. Please join me in welcoming Professor Howard.
It's a leap of faith to be introduced by a former student because I think I gave him good grades, but if I didn't, he might have taken, this might have been payback time. But I'm reminded Carl and I were on the trail together during the constitutional referendum campaign when Virginia adopted its new constitution, and he had Southside Virginia, which was the toughest sell, but he did a wonderful job. I'm delighted to be back at my alma mater. I did my undergraduate work here at the University of Richmond. It's changed a little bit, as you can well imagine, over the years. I recognize a few landmarks, but not that many. But I owe a debt I can never repay to the remarkable professors who taught me here. I think if I've had any kind of career at all, it's been built on a very solid foundation of the liberal arts that I imbibed here at the University of Richmond. Magna Carta is the topic we will take up today. It's been 800 years. June the 15th, 1215 was the anniversary, the original date. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat, so you'll forgive me, I hope. But 800 years, I was in England this summer. I was at Runnymede at the anniversary, and it's obvious that they would be celebrating it. After all, they invented Magna Carta. But I think the question I want to raise this afternoon is, why should we care? You know, what's Magna Carta to us? After all these years and across the ocean, across that span of time. There may be some Winnie the Pooh fans in the audience, perhaps. If so, you know A.A. Milne's work. I first met King, well actually I didn't meet King John, that would be a bit of a stretch. But I was introduced to King John, shall we say, through A.A. Milne's wonderful little book called Now We Are Six. You know that book? Maybe you have read it to your children. If not, you should. And there's a poem in there called King John's Christmas. And it begins something like, King John was not a good man. He had his many ways, and sometimes no one spoke to him for days and days and days. Well, when I read that, and I was a little kid, I couldn't imagine anybody being shunned. You know, you're a kid, nobody will talk to you. How dreadful. Well, I grew up, I did some reading, and I discovered King John wasn't bad, maybe worse, for that matter. So, but we do have to thank him in a sense, because but for King John, we would not have had Magna Carta. I wouldn't have the chance to come down here and talk to you about it. So let's appreciate King John for that. But King John really was one of history's most maladroit monarchs. It's no accident that no king of England since that time has been named John. You will never live to see a John II. It's just not going to happen. He spoiled the name, basically, for kings. But John not only was, I think, a thoroughly bad person, he really was a bad king. He was a bad leader in battle. He managed to lose most of the English possessions in France to defeated the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. He quarreled with the Pope over the appointment of an Archbishop of Canterbury. Not in the age of faith, not a good thing to do. The Pope actually put England under interdict, withdrew sacraments and the like. So that was that quarrel. Then the townspeople of London turned against him, and of course the barons. The barons themselves were the landed and influential class at that time, and he was always leaning on them. He always wanted money, more revenues and the like, and thinking of different ways to extract it, and that gave rise to any number of complaints. So with all these forces arrayed against him, the result was a meeting at Runnymede, June 15, 1215, at which this reluctant king finally agreed to the terms of Magna Carta. Well, I'm not going to go into the provisions of that 13th century document. Most of it is medieval stuff that doesn't really concern us very much here. But there was one particular, actually two provisions that I should mention, chapters 39 and 40 of Magna Carta. Chapter 39 said that, I'm sort of translating as it were, paraphrasing, no one should be proceeded against except by the law of the land. And law of the land came to be known, what we refer to today as due process of law. And his companion chapter, chapter 40, said that justice should not be sold, delayed, or denied. And you recognize both of those as cornerstones of Anglo-American jurisprudence. Well, it all could have ended in 1215 because John never meant to keep the promises. In no way in the world he was going to honor that charter unless he had to. But he died the next year, 1216. One of the chroniclers says that he died of a surfeit of peaches and new cider. I don't know if there's a reception. I see there is a reception. So if anybody offers you peaches and new cider, I think I'd politely decline. So John died. His successor, Henry III, was 9 years old. Now, how long is a 9-year-old kid going to live to be a full-blown king in the Middle Ages? You see Game of Thrones, you know what it's like. So Henry III's advisors, the regent and his companions, hit on what I guess I would call a public relations idea. They said, let's have Henry III reissue Magna Carta by way of a signal of good faith to the English people. And they did that, and that began a long tradition down through the Middle Ages of each monarch coming to the throne reissuing Magna Carta. Now, as we passed through the Middle Ages, there was one interesting moment. A statute was passed in the reign of Edward III that said that if a law was in conflict with Magna Carta, it should be null and void. Now that's a bit of a conundrum because how can one statute be preferred to another? You just got two laws. But I suspect it was an instruction to judges that if they had a case before them with Magna Carta and some other statute, if there was conflict between them, it would give preference to Magna Carta. Whatever it meant, it reflected the rising, emerging notion that somehow Magna Carta was not simply another law, it was simply better than that. Well, I'm going to pass through the Tudor period. I won't even talk about that. I don't suppose that Henry VIII is remembered as a great constitutionalist. Somehow you perhaps would agree. So let me say a word about the 17th century. We're still on the English side. I want to get to the American side in a moment, but the 17th century, think about this as the century which of course was Jamestown, 1607 here in Virginia, and the other American colonies. On the English side, it was, I have to say, a thoroughly dreadful time. It was a time of turbulence and chaos. The Stuarts came to the throne. James VI of Scotland came to the English throne as James I, and he brought with him a notion of divine right of kings. Now, divine right of kings is not a constitutional idea. It places the king above and outside the law. So there was inevitably a collision course between the Stuarts and Parliament. In 1628, Sir Edward Coke, the great commentator on Magna Carta, the leader of the parliamentary forces opposing the pretensions of royal power, said, Magna Carta is such a fellow he will have no sovereign. So in effect, Coke and his colleagues was rediscovering Magna Carta in these contentious powers, conflicts with the crown. That produced another English liberty document, the Great Petition of Right of 1628, that still didn't finally quiet things. And the result finally was civil war between the Cromwellian forces, the Roundheads on the one hand, and the Royalists on the other. And if you remember your English history, you'll know that led finally to the trial and execution of Charles I. A remarkable moment. You can imagine the shock that went through the crowned heads of Europe at the notion that someone would actually try and execute a monarch. So this produced the Cromwellian Commonwealth, Oliver Cromwell and his period. Well, this was an unstable period, and in 1660, I think the English would have had enough of the Stuarts, but they brought the Stuarts back. The Great Restoration of 1660. Well, things weren't too bad under Charles II. He was called the Merry Monarch, best remembered for his mistress. That's about all we remember today about Charles II. But his successor, James II, was pushing Catholicism on a country which by then, after the Reformation, had become Protestant. And so opposition built up to James II, and that produced what historians, I guess they used to call it the Glorious Revolution. I don't know whether that's still the right title or not. It's not so glorious if you're on the losing side of it, I expect. But big history calls it the Glorious Revolution. Out with James II, in with William and Mary in 1689. And part of that settlement, that revolutionary settlement, was another one of the great English liberty documents, the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The prototype for our Bill of Rights, you take the English document and the American Bill of Rights and put them side by side, you'll see the affinity. You'll see provisions in there like cruel and unusual punishment, that sort of thing, which clearly were lifted wholesale from the English document into the American. Well, that's pretty much the English story. What I really want to lay before you, the point of our conversation this afternoon, is to talk about how did Magna Carta get over here? How did it become part of American constitutionalism? Well, the starting point is the Virginia Charter of 1606, the charter that produced the colony of Jamestown. And most of that charter is about commercial matters. People were buying shares in a stock company. They thought they'd make some money. Well, but there's one provision in there, the one that I think is really important, and that says that those who emigrated to Virginia would enjoy the privileges, franchises, and immunities they would have enjoyed in England. Notice if they pulled up roots and came to this wilderness called Virginia, they didn't leave their rights behind. They brought their rights with them, and those rights descended to future generations. Now, it's unclear exactly what those privileges, franchises, and immunities were. You might debate what the content of that provision was. But apparently, the American colonists took it seriously because that became part of the perceived legacy of American constitutionalism. Now, Magna Carta was very much part of the story. If you were to look at a public or private library of that time, 17th century, you would find Cook's commentaries on Magna Carta. You find Cook's law reports and the like. Cook was the man. So he's the guy you should really keep in mind. There were also provisions in those charters that required that the colonial assemblies send ordinances back to England for approval to be sure they were consistent with English law. Now, given the time it took to get documents back and forth across the Atlantic, it's not clear that review mechanism was effective. But it still implanted the idea that when you make laws, there's an external standard by which you measure the validity of that law. There were some interesting episodes in 17th century America. In Massachusetts, for example, Massachusetts was in good part of theocracy. By the way, I was in Boston last year giving something called the James Otis Lecture at Faneuil Hall. And I was talking about Jamestown 1607 and Plymouth 1620. And I was impertinent enough to suggest that while my New England friends were very good at words, they weren't real good at numbers. Somehow they don't quite know that 1607 is the lower number, the I don't think I made any friends in Boston saying that, but I mean, oh well, that's what having tenure at the University of Virginia is all about. So in Massachusetts in the 17th century, there were some dissenters, some malcontents, if you like, who didn't like the way the colony was being run. And they filed a complaint, and the magistrates of the colony probably wish these people would go away, but they replied by way of what's come to be called the parallels of Massachusetts. In one column they had provisions of Magna Carta, and the other column they had provisions of Massachusetts law, and the argument was, you are indeed getting what Magna Carta guarantees. William Penn was another figure when Pennsylvania was founded. Penn was responsible for the first American publication of Magna Carta. So there were concrete ways in which Magna Carta was being carried to and becoming part of American law. Well, that's the 17th century. As you passed into the Revolutionary era, the 18th century, then things get really interesting. And here we start, I think my story becomes all the more engaging. I mentioned James Otis. He was the famous lawyer in Boston who in 1761 argued the famous writs of assistance case. Now, writs of assistance were sort of like general search warrants. They were like open-ended, like a blank check. You just go in and search anybody for anything, whatever. And Otis made an argument representing merchants in Boston that the writs of assistance were, in a modern sense, unconstitutional. He was making, this is before we had a constitution in a formal sense, but he was making the argument, and he cited Cook. He cited in particular a case of Lord Cook, 1610, Dr. Bonham's case, in which Cook had said, if an act of Parliament were against right reason, it would be null and void. Now that's interesting because, you know, we don't associate the United Kingdom with constitutional review. Indeed, citations to Dr. Bonham's case died out in English reports. And by the 18th century, you didn't see it cited very much. But here was Cook saying, on behalf of Americans, there are constitutional limitations even on the powers of Parliament. Whereas on the English side, across the Atlantic, Blackstone's commentaries, which were published in the 1760s, Blackstone said, if Parliament acts in an unreasonable way, I know of no power that can control Parliament. Parliament calls the shots. Parliament is sovereign. Parliament is supreme. So there you have Cook on one side, Blackstone on the other, constitutional limitations on one side, parliamentary sovereignty on the other. Small wonder that the Americans and the British were talking past each other. And in London, they didn't know what the Americans were talking. What do you mean? There are limits on Parliament. Don't you read Blackstone? Surely you realize that that can't be so. So you see at the constitutional level, a conflict is very much brewing. Well, it took concrete form after the 7 Years' War, what in America was the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Britain won the they cleaned house in the 7 Years' War. They picked up a lot of territory. They were largely victorious, but at great expense. It cost a lot of money. It was a huge debt as a result of it. And the British authorities thought, not unreasonably, that the Americans should pay part of the bill because the British had defended our frontier against the French and the Indians, and therefore we should pay off some of this debt. Well, they passed the Stamp Act. And up until that point, there had never been an act of Parliament imposing an internal tax in America. External taxes, yes, but not internal tax. And as you know, the colonists' response was no taxation without representation. Well, there was the Boston Tea Party, famous event, after which the British, they closed the port of Boston, they quartered troops in the houses of colonists, they closed down the colonial assembly, had the governor run the place through a council, and the other colonies rallied to the support of Massachusetts. They called these British acts the coercive or intolerable acts, and so other colonies said, we have something in this battle too. So they all came together in the Continental Congress. And as a constitutional lawyer, what interests me about that Congress was the resolutions they passed. Because those resolutions spelled out the colonists' claims of right no taxation without representation, the right to trial by jury, the right of petition, the right of assembly, rights like that. But then what fascinates me about the argument was the grounds on which the drafters of the resolution placed those claims of right. And what was the theory that lay behind the resolutions of 1774? Well, some of the delegates in Philadelphia said the British Constitution, Magna Carta, and the Liberty Documents of England, that's where it comes from. And others said, well, no, it's the colonial charters, like the language I quoted from Virginia. Still others said, no, it's natural law. It's God's gift. It's the Word of God. It's something hovering above positive law. Well, the delegates in typical American fashion said, fine, let's have them all. So they swept all these theories together into one package and enacted resolutions in which they explicitly grounded them in all those sources that I just mentioned. If you wonder, those of you who studied law, constitutional law, wonder why it's so messy, it always was. We're not like the French, are very analytical and everything is very neat and orderly in their legal system, but not in American constitutional law. Now we pass past the revolution into the age of constitution making, where Carl and I were on the campaign trail when the present Virginia Constitution was adopted. It's, I think, about the sixth one that Virginia's had. Because in May of 1776, the convention in Williamsburg that was acting as a governing body for Virginia, raising troops and arming them and the like, this was the body that instructed Virginia's delegates in Philadelphia to introduce the Resolution for Independence. And on the same day that they sent that resolution forward, they began work on a constitution for Virginia. Actually, they set to work on two documents, a Declaration of Rights and a frame of government. I think that's interesting because today you look at the Constitution of Virginia, the Bill of Rights is simply Article 1. But in the founding period, there was a distinct difference. First thing you do is declare rights. Rights which precede government. This is pure John Locke. This is social compact thinking. That you have natural rights because you are who you are. Then you move on to the business of constructing a frame of government. So that's what they did in Williamsburg. And they, of course, brought into that Declaration of Rights, George Mason being the principal author of it, brought into it many of the memorable and familiar English rights, including due process of law from Magna Carta. Now, there was one fellow who didn't like that first Constitution, Thomas Jefferson. I've always had the notion he probably didn't like it because he wasn't there. Thomas Jefferson couldn't imagine you could do anything about him, right? He was in Philadelphia, but they had to get on with the business in Williamsburg. It was perilous time. So, by the way, it's written into my contract at the University of Virginia that I'm not permitted to give any talk on any subject anywhere without at least one obligatory reference to Thomas Jefferson. Okay. For the record, I just made my obligatory reference to Thomas Jefferson. Well, so his complaint, he had a lot of complaints against that Constitution, but one fundamental objection was that the body of men who wrote the Constitution were also, that was the same body of men who were writing ordinary laws for Virginia. So that meant the Constitution was just another law. If they could write it, they could unwrite it. They could make it, they could unmake it. So therefore, it was not superior to ordinary laws. It wasn't really a Constitution. Well, here's where I have to give credit to my friends in Massachusetts whom I offended the other day. They did in Massachusetts what we didn't do in Virginia. In Massachusetts, when they set out to write their first state constitution, the people in Boston were just going to have what they call the general court or the legislature write the Constitution. People in the western part of the state, Berkshire and those counties, complained. They said, no, the people have to write the Constitution. So they were taking Jefferson's position against the people of Boston. So finally, it was agreed that there would be an election of delegates to a convention in Boston, and that convention went to work on the new Constitution. They gave the work to a committee of 3 people, Sam Bowdoin, John Adams, and Sam Adams, cousins. Bowdoin and Sam Adams then just gave the word to John Adams, who was the sort of the workhorse who, hey, John Adams, he said, hey, you want to write a constitution? No problem, I can do that. I think Sam and Bowdoin went off to a tavern somewhere. Go to a tavern in Richmond and ask for a John Adams beer. No. When you get a blank stare, ask for a Sam Adams beer, and then you'll actually get something. John Adams was not one of history's modest people. He ultimately thought this Massachusetts Constitution was really the embryo of the U.S. Constitution. It's an interesting document because the Massachusetts Constitution weaves in all the teachings of Magna Carta and British constitutionalism with notions of covenant. They actually use the word in the Constitution, covenant and compact, interchangeably. So you see this heavy dose of religious influence in Massachusetts. So think about the state constitution-making period as one of the stepping stones to modern American constitutionalism. Well, this brings us to Philadelphia, 1787. Now, there is no complete transcript of the convention. James Madison famously kept notes, but it might have been 10% of what was actually said. But as far as I know, I may have missed something, but I'm not aware that anybody in Philadelphia at any point during the convention mentioned Magna Carta. Well, then, you know, how could that be? I've just told you this story, unless I've been making it all up, of how important Magna Carta was in the Revolutionary period. It was one of the cornerstones of American notions of constitutionalism, and yet it doesn't come up in Philadelphia. Well, if that's true, I think you have to think about the difference between what was happening at Runnymede in the 13th century and what was happening in Philadelphia in the 18th. That at Runnymede, the barons were out to trim the power of the king, limit his power, whereas in Philadelphia they were writing a constitution for a new country. Very different enterprise from Runnymede in the 13th century. And I think that if I were to ask the Federalists, if I could bring the Federalists back and say, why wasn't Magna Carta important to you? They probably would say, well, look, think about the difference. This is their view. They would say, Magna Carta was a grant from the king to the barons, whereas we're writing a constitution which is based on we the people who ordain and establish the Constitution. And I think they would also argue that Magna Carta was a limit on royal power, and the Constitution was meant to be a limit on all the branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. Well, whatever their reasoning, the nearly fatal mistake they made in Philadelphia was rejecting the motion to add to the Bill of Rights. Elbridge Gerry and George Mason are the one the Bill of Rights that was rejected. And as you know from your study of history, that handed what became the Anti-Federalists the most powerful argument they could make against the new government. They could say, look, no Bill of Rights, they're neglecting the people's rights. Well, in the ratification debates, it was a close call. Virginia ratified by 10 votes. New York ratified by 6 votes. And a handful of votes would have changed the outcome. In Virginia, and New York had stayed out. It's hard to imagine that it could have gone back to the drafting table a second time. So James Madison and the others said, okay, we get the point. We will just ratify the Constitution, and then at the first Congress, we will propose amendments by way of the Bill of Rights. And as you know, that's exactly what James Madison did. So the story, I think, when you bring together what was happening here in America over those centuries, is a blend of innovation on the one hand and tradition on the other. Innovation, American federalism has no real historical parallel. Judicial review was, for centuries, a very uncommon thing. Indeed, it was only after World War II that many other countries began adopting anything like the American system of judicial review. So those were distinctively American contributions, but they were blended with tradition, drawn in particular from Magna Carta and its legacy in America. So how to sum up the legacy of Magna Carta? Where, in what respect is it part of American constitutionalism? Well, first, it is the iconic representation of what we like to call the rule of law. Now, that's a phrase that the American lawyers use fairly loosely, as if it were self-defining, as if it were needed no further explication. I remember being in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, working with the lawyers and judges who were drafting the first post-Soviet Russian constitution. You remember those days when we thought Russia might become a liberal constitutional democracy? Well, it seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? Well, during these conference discussions, there was a very good translator. I don't speak any Russian, so I was working through a translator. And I discovered that the young woman who's doing the translating was rendering the English phrase rule of law as socialist legality. And I had to say, well, no, that's not exactly what we mean when we talk about rule of law. Secondly, Magna Carta is associated with the whole notion of fundamental right, articulating fundamental right. I've traveled into other countries, and I don't think there's any country on earth in which people are so rights-oriented. Our whole language, our rhetoric, our notions are in terms of rights. I mean, there are no people I know of that are so quick to turn a garden variety dispute into a lawsuit and a lawsuit into a constitutional complaint as we are in America. I sometimes think our national motto ought to be something like, I'll see you in court. Third, the idea of putting it in writing, written constitution. The idea of a constitution has been around for centuries, millennia. I mean, Aristotle talked about constitutions in ancient Greece. But the first written constitution, national constitution, was that in Philadelphia in 1787. And it built on a long tradition of English documents going back to and beyond Magna Carta. Fourthly, I think, and here we get to, I think, one of the really interesting and fundamental propositions, and that is Magna Carta is part of the road that takes us to constitutional supremacy. Constitutions that actually are meant to be and are superior to ordinary law. Remember that statute I mentioned, Edward III, about conflicting statutes being null and void. Recall James Otis's argument in Boston about invoking Lord Coke. This is on the road to the supremacy clause of the Constitution. You know, Article 6, where it says, this Constitution and all laws in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. That's the language which John Marshall, of course, in Marbury versus Madison, said, well, that must mean the power of the court to strike down even an act of Congress is named unconstitutional. Again, those of you who have studied law, you may remember the first time you read Marbury. And when I first read it, I was amused by the fact that Marshall begins the opinion with general principles of jurisprudence. The idea of what is the Constitution about? It must be superior law. And it's fairly late in the opinion where he finally says, oh yes, and by the way, there's the language of Article 6, the supremacy clause. I mean, today you start with the language and then build from there, but Marshall was reaching out to general principles to say, of course, it's self-evident that the court has to uphold the Constitution. Fifth, and finally, about the legacy of Magna Carta, excuse me, I associate Magna Carta with a tradition of organic constitutional development. Justice Scalia is not in the room, is he? If he were here, I'd be very careful how I put this. It seems to me it leads to the whole notion of what has come to be called the living Constitution. As you know, those are fighting words in Justice Scalia's quarters. But it seems to me, to the extent that the American constitutional story is organic, unfolding, evolving, and developing, that is something that traces back to Magna Carta. Think about language like, I mentioned cruel and unusual punishment, the language of the English Bill of Rights. I'm thinking of Supreme Court cases. In 1989, the court had two decisions under two death cases. One involved the potential execution of a youthful offender, someone who was 15 at the time of the crime. And the other case involved the death penalty for the somewhat mentally retarded. And in both cases, the court rejected the argument that to use the death penalty in those situations would be a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Well, only a few years later, I think in 2002, 2005, the Supreme Court, pretty much the same court, overruled both of those 1989 cases and held that in each of those situations, there was a violation of the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. That's an example, and there's so many more I could give of evolving constitutional standards. And of course, due process of law. Is there any phrase in the lexicon of the American lawyer that's been more malleable, put to more service, more uses than due process of law? For example, Justice Kennedy, this is Lawrence versus Texas, 2003. This was the case in which the court struck down a Texas anti-sodomy law as being unconstitutional. And he said, this is Kennedy, those who drew and ratified the due process clause did not presume to know the components of liberty in its manifold possibilities. The times can blind us to certain truths, and later generations can see that laws once thought necessary and proper serve only to oppress. As the Constitution endures, persons in every generation can invoke its principles in their own search for greater freedom. As you know, that is a proposition that not every justice on the court buys into. That was in Kennedy in 2003. If you read the court's same-sex marriage opinion earlier this year, Obergefell, near the end of, again, Kennedy wrote the majority opinion. The very end of his opinion, he states almost word for word the language I just quoted. And I was fascinated that normally you'd expect him to quote it, put it in quotation marks, and cite the earlier case. He doesn't do that. He just says it, as if, at least in Kennedy's mind, it has become a self-evident proposition. Needs no citation, needs no quotation. So I think that is very much part of when there's constitutional law in America. So absolutely fascinating as part of the debate over what the Constitution means. Now, one last thought. I talked about what happened at Runnymede in 1215, producing that document called Magna Carta. There actually are a lot of Magna Cartas because printing press scribes had to write out copies of them. It is thought that the original plan was to send a copy of Magna Carta to each cathedral town in England. Most have not survived. There are 4 extant copies of the 1215 Charter. 2 are in the British Library in London. One's at Lincoln Cathedral. If you went to Washington this past winter, you may have seen that copy on display. And then one copy at Salisbury Cathedral in Wiltshire. Those 4, all together, if you count all the copies from 1215 to 1297, when Magna Carta went on the statute books of England, there are 17 extant copies. All of them are in England except for 2. One's in Australia and one's in Washington. I was on a plane flying to London one time and my seatmate happened to be a lawyer from Texas. And it turned out he was Ross Perot's personal lawyer. Now, Ross Perot, as you know, is a man of some means. And at one point, Ross Perot heard that there was a copy of Magna Carta owned by a private family in England that might be available. And so Ross said, I don't have a copy of Magna Carta. I think I'd like to have that. So he sent this lawyer over to bargain for it. This was back in the 1980s. And the lawyer struck a deal for $1.5 million. No small amount of money in the 1980s. Or even now. So I said, okay, you buy Magna Carta, this copy. How'd you get it out? Doesn't England have laws about its patrimony? And at the export of things like that. I said, why don't you get to Heathrow Airport? What did they ask you about? He said, first I took this copy of Magna Carta, rolled it up, put it in a mailing tube. I said, you put Magna Carta in a mailing tube. And I went to Heathrow Airport, and the customs agent official asked me what I had in the mailing tube. And I said, well, I've got a copy of Magna Carta. And the agent said, right, chap, go on through. So, thinking he had a facsimile of Magna Carta, a copy of Magna Carta. So I said, fine, you get on the airplane, what happens then? He said, well, put it in the overhead bin. And I said, where people put their ski boots or their backpacks on. Well, somehow it survived the trip and got home. So that copy was on display for a while at the archives. Then I guess Ross Perot decided he didn't need to have this copy of Magna Carta anymore, so he put it on auction at Sotheby's in New York. And another man of some means, David Rubenstein, heard about it and bidding through an agent over the phone, bid for Magna Carta and acquired it at a price of $21.5 million. Now you know why Ross Perot has a lot of money. From 1.5 to 21.5 is not a bad markup. So David Rubenstein bought this copy and put it on permanent loan at the National Archives. Well, the archives called me and said, would I come and give a lecture on the occasion of the inauguration of this exhibit? And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. So the Washington Post each Thursday has a little box, and they pick 3 or 4 things that are interesting that you might like to go and see or hear the next week. And in this particular week, it had something like Professor A.E. Dick Howard at the University of Virginia on Tuesday, March 10th at 7:30 p.m. will be at the National Archives to talk about his book, The Road for Runnymede, and his purchase of a copy of Magna Carta for $21.5 million. So I went home that night and I told my wife, I said, Mary, we're going to start getting some really interesting phone calls. And I said, we're going to be invited to some very fancy dinners and parties. I said, don't ask any questions, just say yes. So, well, it passed. We did get very good invitations. So, anyway, there you have the story. I hope at least I've engaged you to think that there are reasons why Magna Carta came to America. And we don't live in feudal times. We're not concerned, I think, with the pretensions of monarchs like King John, but it does seem to me that Magna Carta remains very much at the heart of the story of not only the English but the Americans in their search for the promise of what I might call order and liberty. Thank you very much. I understand we have time for a few questions, and I'd be happy to entertain questions. Yes?
First of all, thank you. I'm sure with everyone in the room.
Thank you.
The United Kingdom and the United States have deep roots going back to the document you've just been discussing. But we've evolved slightly differently. We have a written constitution, which we hold in great reverence. They have an unwritten one. Could you say a word about the differences between those two systems?
She's referencing, if you've heard the question, the difference between the American side having a written constitution, what we all know about, and the United Kingdom being almost the only country on earth that doesn't. Israel doesn't, for reasons which are purely a result of Israeli politics and lack of common ground there. New Zealand has a partial constitution with Bill of Rights, but not a complete constitution. I think in Swaziland, the king simply said, I am the Constitution, which actually simplifies constitutional law a lot. You just ask the king, what does it say, and he tells you. But the United Kingdom, as we all know, famously does not have a written constitution. And when I was over there this summer, we were giving some lectures in England, and in the Q&A sessions there, the question that came up the most often was, Professor Howard, should we in the United Kingdom have a written constitution? And I had to say, look, I'm an American visitor. I didn't come here to give advice, but I did say, but on the other hand, if you decide to have one, I still had to let it happen. If we do it in Virginia, we can do it in London. I'm interested in what I would say is some convergence between the United Kingdom and America in the following respect. They don't have a written constitution. Judges in England do not have the power to declare an act of Parliament unconstitutional, but they have a middle ground called the Human Rights Act of 1998, in which an English judge, looking at the European Convention on Human Rights, can take an act of Parliament and declare it to be incompatible with the European Convention. Now that imposes not a legal duty on Parliament, but a political duty. And so far, at least in almost every case, Parliament, the government has introduced a bill to change English law to bring it into line with European norms. There has been some real problem lately about prisoners voting is a sticking point. But for the most part, this is kind of a middle ground between outright parliamentary sovereignty and outright judicial review. There is talk in England today of maybe having an entrenched Bill of Rights, but it's not clear to me that they mean entrenched in our sense. So I think, so they're still a long way from where we are, but they are under some pressures. Scottish devolution, which could lead to a road of something like federalism, a more diverse population, so there are more discrimination issues, the overriding level of European law, which is in theory at least superior to national law. A lot of factors that I think you might want to watch that space and see where the UK goes from here. So that's, thank you, interesting question to start us out. Other questions? Is my hand? I must have left a few loose ends. I'm not sure of that, but yes, sir.
Well, Dick, I hate for you to get off scot-free.
I knew he was just biding his time.
You know, I had a student once who said that the rule of law is a misnomer. And what he was referring to was the fact that, yes, we have a constitution, but the Constitution is whatever the Supreme Court says it is. So how is it that we have the rule of law if, in fact, the law is whatever?
So you think what we have is a rule of what 9 people says it is? Is that the bottom line? It's a rule of what 9 people, 9 justices of the Supreme Court say it is. You know, that's interesting. I have maybe a variation on that. I've sometimes played with the idea that maybe the Constitution is not what the Supreme Court says it is, but what people ask the Supreme Court to say it is. Because I think over the long haul, there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the American nation at large and the Supreme Court. Sometimes the court gets ahead of the country, like Brown versus Board, clearly ahead of what much of the country was about in 1954. In the New Deal period, the so-called 9 old men were standing in the way of Franklin Roosevelt's program. They finally had to step out of the way and let that get on. And so it seems to me there's a kind of conversation that goes on that in some organic sense, I think there is a popular, mandate's too strong a word, but some popular restraint on the court. But I think getting closer to the heart of your question, we get preoccupied with the handful of really controversial Supreme Court cases. They issue currently about 70 or 80 opinions on the merits each year. Sometimes it used to be more than that. The vast majority of those are statutory cases that nobody cares about except the lawyers and parties. It comes down to a half a dozen or so hot-button cases, same-sex marriage, cases of that sort, the ones that Affordable Care Act, you know, every term there are 1 or 2 like that. Well, of course, they are the tough cases. They're not in the Supreme Court if they were pretty easy calls. What one overlooks is the vast substructure of constitutionalism, which is largely agreed upon, which is not litigated, or if it is, the answers come through an assembly. I mean, there are parts of the Constitution that are perfectly plain how a bill becomes a law. Congress can't just pass a law if the president vetoes it, they have the right to veto. I don't think anybody really questions that. The tough cases come with general language like due process, are proven unusual. And I'm bound to think that when the framers put language like that in the Constitution, they realized that was serviceable language which future generations would have to reinterpret. Because that's the way it had always been. Due process in the 18th century didn't mean what it had been in the time of King John. And of course it doesn't today, it's exactly what it did in the 18th century. So to that extent, it seems to me that the court is bound by something I would call a rule of law. Maybe that's not a very satisfying answer to people. I find people who are upset about the Supreme Court tend to get really upset by the result and not the reasoning. If they like the way the court came out, fine. If it doesn't, it must be a court of our judicial activism. And that's what conservatives were saying with the Warren Court. It's what liberals are saying about the Roberts Court. It depends on whose ox that neck is being gored. But thank you for a good question. Yes, sir.
How do you feel about term limits on Supreme Court justices?
Term limits. That's interesting. I think that's a plausible idea. Most other countries who have constitutional or Supreme Courts have term limits. They're elected for a term of years or an age limit, or maybe sometimes both. I'm not persuaded that the time has come for that myself. I think it perhaps ought to be a matter of open debate. I'm not sure we'd be better off, worse off with term limits. One argument would be sometimes justices just get too old, too unfit to serve. There have been historical cases like that. William O. Douglas, for example, hung on past his time. But with John Paul Stevens, for example, I think stepped down at 89. He's still out there writing remarkable articles in the New York books. So I guess I'm ambivalent about that particular point. You advocate term limits, do you? Is that what? Are you an advocate for term limits?
Something I'll do that.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good rallying cry, right? This ought to be one of those audiences where everybody has a little clicker and we can say, "Are you for term limits?" Yes, sir.
The Virginia Constitution is now, what, 44 years old?
Yes, that's right.
5 years old. But what was the most difficult issue that you wrestled with when you were writing the Virginia Constitution?
Well, that's really interesting. The revision process came about when Mills Godwin appointed a commission on constitutional revision. And his concern at that time was fairly focused. He was concerned that under the old Constitution, we had exhausted our borrowing capacity. He wanted community colleges, and there was no way to issue bonds for them. But the commission was made up of some extraordinary men. Lewis Powell, later on the U.S. Supreme Court, Hardy Dillard, later on the World Court, Oliver Hill, the leading civil rights attorney of that generation. It's a genuinely blue ribbon committee. And I saw them rise to the opportunity to rewrite the 1902 Constitution, which was hopelessly outmoded, populist, racist, and just really a bad Constitution. So it was, instead of just tinkering, they really rewrote it. What they did recognize, sensibly, was that the draft that they produced then had to go through the legislative process. The General Assembly was the one that would put it to the people. And they knew there were some issues that the legislature had to be left to tackle that the commission couldn't take on. I'll just give you one example that may not be the best one, but a concrete one is Dillon's rule. The rule that says that localities only have those powers explicitly granted to them by general law. It means the counties and cities are on a very short leash. The commission proposed that Dillon's rule be reversed. And the General Assembly reversed the commission. They said, we'll keep Dillon's rule. And the Virginia Municipal League and the Virginia Association of Counties agreed with the Assembly. And I was surprised. I said, why wouldn't localities want more powers? Well, what they were afraid of is you reverse Dillon's rule, and then the Assembly would weigh in and pass lots of general laws, and things would be worse than they were before. I think the local government part of the new Constitution is not. For example, city boundaries, annexation, all those things have just been frozen. That would be one candidate. I think, trying to think, one-term limit on governor. I think it's a mistake. I think the governor should be able to run for one additional term. He's done a good job letting people vote him in or out as they please. Because in 4 years' time, the governor inherits the previous governor's budget. He's halfway through his term before he devises his own budget. By then he's a lame duck, he or she. So there are some things but I'd say on balance, it's so much better than the old Constitution, even if there's some things that. I thought you were going to ask the question, why isn't it time to rewrite the Constitution? When I went around, Linwood Holton asked me if I would chair the committee that was undertaking the ratification process, that was going on. So I went and made speeches around Virginia, different groups, and I quoted Thomas Jefferson everywhere, because he wrote a famous letter saying each generation should rewrite the Constitution. And I said, look, it's 60 years old. We're way overdue. Well, I guess my Jeffersonian calculations were overdue now, but I would be scared silly to imagine what would happen today if the General Assembly tried to rewrite the Constitution. So maybe I'm not as Jeffersonian as I thought I was. But I don't think it's going to happen. But yes, sir.
Quick question about, you feel like there's a lot of, obviously, divergence between the U.S. and the U.K., but I noticed in recent years, the U.K. has established a Supreme Court.
Yes.
I know it's very different from ours, and I guess it still doesn't have the concept of judicial review, so I guess I'm wondering what it actually does. How does it function in their system?
The question is about the UK's, they do now have a Supreme Court. 5 or 6 years ago that this took place. And I had lunch one time with the justice of their Supreme Court. And I said, I'm being a little bit devilish, I said, could it be that because you're now called a Supreme Court, you might start thinking like a Supreme Court? And he didn't argue the point with me, he accepted that. But this is basically, they have the functions that used to be the judicial body within the House of Lords. So what they've done is they've taken the judge, to that extent, what the law lords used to do, except they put it in the Supreme Court. But you're absolutely right, they still do not have the power of our Supreme Court. They don't have the power of what we would call judicial review. But I think simply by making the body more visible, more dignified, as it were, is bound. I think over time we'll see a gradual increase of power there. I may be quite wrong. I mean, even I mentioned the Human Rights Bill of 1998. But even under bills like that, it's still clear that under British UK constitutional theory, Parliament makes the final decisions. Blackstone still reigns in England. Question way in the back, and then yours.
Mr.
Yes,
Ross is ahead of me.
Okay.
I will
He's
yield
given
my older.
pride of place to you.
Since you're prepared to take questions on the Virginia Constitution,
Why not?
have you expressed recently what you intended and the commission intended in the General Assembly, the phrase compact districts?
Oh my goodness, yes. You know, I planned these questions. Since we're a little off topic, but I let it happen, didn't I, with the Virginia Constitution? There's a provision of the Virginia Constitution, and this actually sort of responds to the question about things that we didn't get right. We tried. There's a provision that says legislative districts shall be compact and contiguous. Now that language was not in the old Constitution. It's not self-defining, but you get the general feel of it, right? That you can't draw these weird-looking districts. When you look at the electoral maps of Virginia, you know what legislators do. But whatever party, this is a bipartisan exercise, you know. Whoever's in power draws the districts to suit incumbents and to favor their party. Okay, we'll take that as a political given. You would think that the Virginia Constitution would impose some general restrictions on that. But when the Supreme Court of Virginia had a case involving, a few years back, that case involving an attack on bizarre-looking districts. One of the districts, if I'm remembering the case rightly, part of the district was down in Hampton, was over in Hampton, on the west side of Chesapeake Bay, Hampton Roads. And the rest of the district was down in Norfolk, Portsmouth, I guess it was. Pretty good span of water lying between those two parts of the district. Well, when the Supreme Court of Virginia took that case, they looked at it and said, well, the district is joined by a body of water that's compact and contiguous. Well, what that really, if you read that opinion, what it really means is the Supreme Court of Virginia did not want those cases. It did not want to have to second guess the legislature. And they in fact cited as precedent cases decided under the old Constitution. And there were no such standards. So now the U.S. Supreme Court, by the way, is equally weak-kneed about these cases. It will not take and decide cases of partisan gerrymandering of the most, I mean, all of you read about these districts. They are bizarre, they're unfair. Most of us live in districts which are not competitive. Most of us are disenfranchised. Most people in America live in districts where your vote doesn't count in the general election. It's only the primary that counts. When I go to other countries and compare constitutions, I'm a little hard-pressed to defend that as being a democratic way to run a country. So I think the Virginia court and the U.S. Supreme Court have been equally unwilling to get into what they would call a political thicket. What else could we do? I suppose we could come back to contiguous and then add the caveat, and we really need it. See if they can do something about it. Yes, so there's a question
I
about
wanted
you.
to respond to your and my fraternity brother, West's comment about the rule of law. My interpretation of it is that when the ruling is made, it's what we do with it afterwards, that we obey it, we live with it until it's changed.
That's
the rule of law.
he should have been the speaker. That is a lovely definition of the rule of law. It's not the fact that you have a rule, it's what you do with it afterwards. And I think here is the difference between the United States and some other countries, not all of them obviously, but most countries have constitutions. Most countries would say, yes, we have a rule of law. They have laws, they have rules. But as you say, are they in fact implemented after the fact? And what we have in this country, so I think in response to your question, I think I would call it something like a constitutional culture, where the people at large, they'll complain about Supreme Court decisions, and they'll find decisions they just can't abide and say, how could these justices tell the rest of us that that's the law of this country? But by and large, with some fringe exceptions, we put up with it. We get on, we fight the next election, we get different justices on the court, we have ways that we pass laws and the like, ways of dealing with it, but we don't go to the barricades. We don't just shake our fist and say, I am not going to obey that decree. There have been historical exceptions. Virginia, massive resistance, we all remember that period. But it passes. Somehow the system survives that. So thank you so much for that additional, and I would say improved definition of the rule of law. So have we run out?
We might have time for one more.
One more, yes, sir.
If I may, Professor Howard, considering the historic significance of the Magna Carta and its use in many countries, do you have any thoughts or comments on the recent situation in China about the display of the Magna Carta, where it's been moved from Beijing University for citizens?
China is I worked with Hong Kong when they were doing their basic law, but I've not actually spent time in China. The farthest reach of systems around the world, of existing, good, functioning systems, China must be the greatest test of whether it can someday have a liberal, constitutional, democratic system. And you'll hear talk about the rule of law in China. Now, this is secondhand reactions on my part because I haven't spent time there. But my sense is that you may remember when China was first emerging as a major economic force maybe 20, 25 years ago, there was a theory abroad that if China would develop economically, would prosper, create something like what we would call a middle class, that constitutional government would follow. And I think we have to set that assumption aside. It hasn't proved that way. That China is obviously a much more prosperous country than it was, but it has not achieved what I would call, what I think we would call a rule of law. And I think the Chinese authorities are seeing a problem here because in an age of social media and the like, Chinese people know what's going on in other places. As they get more prosperous, they're more educated, better informed. And there's so much lawlessness, corruption, and the like at the local level in China that the regime feels for its own survival it has to do something about it. The problem is the country's so vast that the people they're picking off by way of prosecutions and the like tend to be at the very upper echelons. But what do you do about provincial chiefs and cities and provinces and things like that? There you say you're dealing with corruption and a culture which doesn't share what I just call the constitutional culture. I don't know, I'm giving a very general response to that, but what this really invites is to tell you, if you talk about constitutions generally, if everybody has one, some are real and some are sham. And what you realize is the extent to which, despite this search for universal principles, Magna Carta and the like, that constitutions ultimately their success or failure is contingent on history, on tradition, on culture, on politics, on a particular place. It's really no one shoe fits all sizes kind of regime. But nice, thank you for that last question around that. Thank you so much.